There are objects that hold secrets that words cannot tell. And in my career as a forensic doctor, once a simple object spoke for itself and revealed a truth that no one expected. An elderly man appeared without external signs indicating how he had died. Everything seemed clear, but a small, almost invisible detail changed the course of the investigation. What I found reminded me that the body can lie, but the environment never does. Hello, I am Dr. Esteban Landa, forensic doctor in Mexico City, and today I will tell you about one of the most revealing cases I've had in my career. But before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. The victim was a man of approximately 75 years old, found in his apartment by a concerned neighbor who hadn't seen him for days. The initial report mentioned natural death, but there was something that didn't fit. It was the way his personal belongings were organized, or rather, disorganized. Upon arriving at the scene, the first thing I noticed was the apparent calm. There were no signs of struggle or visible violence. His face showed serenity, as if he had fallen asleep and never woken up. But in forensic medicine, silence also speaks and sometimes shouts. On a nearby table, under a dim light, there was a small antique device, a pocket watch. But it was not just any watch. It had a subtle inscription on its back, barely visible to the naked eye. It was then that I began to understand that this object not only marked time, but also carried a hidden message. That inscription led me to question everything. Could that watch tell a hidden story? Was there something in this case that escaped untrained eyes? From that moment on, patience and detailed observation became my best allies. Every piece of the scene had to be analyzed with precision. In forensic medicine, we examine not only bodies, but also environments, objects, and even the very time surrounding them. Every detail can be the key that clears up a mystery or deepens it even more. I want you to join me in this story, because what seemed like a simple death turned into a lesson in humility and attention to detail that I will never forget. Ready to discover how a small object spoke louder than any witness? Then follow carefully, because in every shadow there is a secret waiting to be revealed. When I arrived at the scene, I expected a routine case, something simple that wouldn't take me more than a few hours, without major complications or surprises. An older man, apparently alone, with no visible signs of violence or struggle in his surroundings or on his body. Everything seemed to be in order, almost boring for a forensic doctor with years of experience in Mexico City, used to having to search for tiny pieces of a complicated puzzle. However, while examining the gentleman's apartment, my eyes caught something subtle yet out of place, a small object on the table next to the window, which seemed taken from another scene. It was a pocket watch, old-fashioned, quite worn, like one would think it stopped being used decades ago. But that watch was not there by chance, nor was it a mere decoration or forgotten keepsake. The first thing I thought was that maybe it had been there for a long time, but something made me take it very seriously. At first glance, the man seemed to have died of natural causes, with no marks or obvious signs. But that watch had an inscription engraved, almost imperceptible, on the inner lid, which immediately caught my attention. It was not a common inscription. Rather, it seemed like a coded message, a kind of personal cipher, whose meaning someone had left to be found only by someone who truly wanted to search for it. Carefully opening the lid, the writing was so small and elegant that I had to use a meticulous magnifying glass that I always carry with me. It said something like, "Not everything is as it seems when time abandons us." That phrase hit me hard, not because it was an enigma in itself, but because it seemed like a clue inviting me to look beyond the body and what was visible. As routine and simple as the case seemed, something was there, right before my eyes, waiting for someone to see it, for someone to hear it. And despite how tired I was that day, and believe me, sometimes cases like these make me think about just closing my eyes and sighing, I decided I couldn't let it go. That day, patience was my best ally. I knew I couldn't rush, that I had to observe from a certain distance, and, above all, with respect. Experience has taught me that every object at a death scene has a story, and that watch was speaking to me. I dusted it off a bit, without disturbing its position, and returned to the man's body for a more detailed examination. Although he showed no wounds or signs of violence, Certain minimal, almost technical signs began to emerge as I examined more calmly. These are the kind of things you don't notice at first glance. Slight congestion in the neck, almost undetectable, or something in the relaxed position of the fingers on his right hand, which seemed quite unusual for someone who had died of natural causes. There was a slight tremor, as if he had tried to hold on to something at the end. But the really strange and puzzling part began when I looked at the way the body rested next to the table where the watch was. There was a small, almost imperceptible stain, with a slightly oily shine, which did not correspond to blood or any usual bodily fluid. That stain was right next to an old, dry pen that seemed to have been doubtfully and carelessly left there. The atmosphere spoke of a moment of tension, of a final internal conversation that had been silenced, of a secret kept in the shadows of time. As the investigation progressed, I requested some special tests. I asked the laboratory to check the dust and residues on the watch and around the table. While waiting, I delved into the man's personal history. I discovered that this man, a retired widower, had lived many years in that same apartment, almost secluded. His only apparent companions were the small watch and some old objects he kept from his youth. But I also discovered a fact that no one seemed to have noticed at first. In recent months, he had sporadic visits, not from family or friends, but from people who seemed to be looking for something. Neighbors remember because sometimes they came and went hurriedly, with nervous looks. That information changed everything in my mind. Could the watch have been a message or a signal? Something someone had left for him, or he himself had left for others, but which ended up being the key to understanding his death. Questions began to pile up, and the tension rose. Why leave such a curious object in plain sight? What did that phrase hidden inside the lid mean? I began to suspect that behind that superficial calm, there was a deeper story, perhaps a family secret, a betrayal, or even a covered-up crime. During the autopsy, I found slight signs of an uncommon poison, something that wasn't in the first standard series of tests we usually perform in natural cases. A chemical that would have slowly affected his nervous system, leaving no obvious traces, making the death seem casual or due to old age. That made me review the scene again, this time paying more attention to the interaction between objects and the environment. The watch was not only a clue, it was a silent witness, a kind of mute narrator of what had happened. I decided to ask for help from an expert in antique watches, and what he told me left me even more shocked. That watch was a limited edition, made over 80 years ago, usually belonging to very select people, and there was a legend around that specific model. Supposedly, its owners used it to send encrypted messages, hidden characters that could only be discovered with special light or under certain conditions. That information led me to look for something else at the scene, a special light, a filter, something that could reveal more hidden inscriptions. After a few hours, patience and thoroughness rewarded me. Under the watch, in the less visible part of the table, I found a small stain of invisible ink that appeared upon contact with an ultraviolet light I always carry in my kit. The message was puzzling and at the same time incredible. A list of names, dates, and specific references to certain events that seemed to include dates of visits, payments, and debts. It was not just a mystery about his death, but a story of corruption, threats, and vendettas that man had carried with him until his last breath. It wasn't just a natural death, nor even a simple covered-up murder. It was as if he'd been a living enigma, surrounded by secrets too dangerous to come to light. That watch, that small piece of evidence, had shown me that behind that apparent calm, there was a hidden storm. At that moment, sitting in the office with all my thoughts swirling, I clearly understood that meticulousness and respect for every detail had changed the course of the investigation. I had discovered that the man, quietly, had left a kind of secret legacy, a warning and a testimony engraved in an object that, to anyone else, would have been just that, an old watch, nothing more important. But for us, who dedicate ourselves to listening to what bodies and objects have to say, it was the voice of a life that wanted to be understood after its passing. That case taught me to value slowness, careful observation, and patience, because sometimes what seems insignificant or inconsequential can be the key that opens the door to a hidden universe. I also reaffirmed that as forensic doctors we are, in a way, detectives of time and guardians of secrets that only details can reveal. Every case, no matter how simple or common it seems, has the capacity to show us another truth, a message not written in visible words, but in hidden strokes, in forgotten objects, and in those small things that, if we don't listen to them carefully, will go unnoticed forever. Because in the end, every body has its story, every object its voice, and every death its truth, although sometimes only someone willing to stop and look with an open heart can discover it. And that day, that watch spoke to me, taught me, and forever changed the way I see my work. Nothing would ever be so simple or routine again. That's how I learned that, in forensic medicine, as in life, patience, observation, and genuine respect for details hide the answers we need to understand what is left unsaid. You just have to know how to listen. That revelation plunged me into a labyrinth of possibilities and forced me to look far beyond the body before me, beyond what death had made evident. The list in invisible ink was not a mere random note. It was meticulously crafted testimony. Dates, names, references that seemed to correspond to a network of relationships and debts that apparently escaped the superficial view of any conventional investigation. Something told me I was facing a tangled web someone had tried to hide at all costs, and the gentleman, with the discretion and weight of his years, had decided that this watch would be his confident and silent voice. That night, when I returned to the office after leaving the scene, I couldn't help but review every detail in almost obsessive care. I had the watch on the table, open under the soft light of my desk, and the message barely visible consumed my hours. I called an old colleague expert in cryptanalysis, someone who in his youth had worked with codes and secret communications in police cases. The encryption was not complex, but the way it was encoded, hiding important dates and names, indicated something more. It was not just a record. It was a warning, a map of the danger surrounding the man, and possibly the key to understanding his abrupt end. The visit's neighbors had mentioned alongside those payments and dates indicated a network of pressure and blackmail. What was shocking was learning that the list included individuals who, years earlier, had appeared in news reports for shady matters. Corrupt officials, businessmen with accusations in court and outside the law. This tinged investigation with a different color, darker and more dangerous, beyond a simple, isolated death. In my career, I had learned that the deadliest secrets hide where least expected, and that death is often just the last page of a much longer and bitter story. The next day, I requested intensified toxicological analyses for any strange substances in the body and environment. The initial tests, as I mentioned, showed signs of an uncommon poison, but this deeper examination revealed a substance similar to a very rare alkaloid, almost forgotten among the compounds certain groups used to eliminate quietly and without clear signs. That made me think the gentleman had not only been the victim of a conscious act, but also had time to try to leave clues, to reveal the hidden truth before dying. It was as if he understood that the watch and its message could be the final chapter, the last hope that his story would not be buried with him. While waiting for more complete results, I decided to return to the apartment to inspect it once again, this time accompanied by a team of crime scene experts. We examined every corner, every piece of furniture, every object thoroughly. Beneath the dust of some old books long forgotten, there were torn pages from personal diaries, notes that apparently had no direct relation to his death, but started to form a context. Brief accounts, references to trips, people he sometimes received in secret, concerns about threats, and unease over unspecified matters. These fragments gave a clear impression of the man's mental and emotional state. Someone who lived in fear though silent. Someone who felt watched and in danger. Then a small but unsuspected discovery completely changed the scenario. Behind a painting hanging on the living room wall, I found a rigid envelope, carefully sealed and hidden, something common in people wanting to conceal important documents. I opened it with great caution, and inside found old photographs, many of groups of people at formal meetings and other social events. At first glance, they seemed like simple images from a distant past, but upon closer inspection, one photo had a peculiar symbol in the corner, an emblem that immediately reminded me of clandestine society, well known in certain circles of power and business, the very same to which several of the names on the watch's encrypted list belonged. The tension soared instantly. It was clear the man was entangled in a network of power, influence, and prohibitive risks, perhaps something that had haunted him for decades and had finally caught up with him. I also knew, from experience and the attitude of those who had initially prevented me full access to the scene, that I was touching dangerous Very powerful characters willing to do anything to keep secrets like these from coming to light. However, what truly marked a turning point in the investigation was a convergence of all these elements that seemed disparate, almost random, but together formed a grim and deceitful narrative. A hidden poison, an encrypted message, inexplicable visits, scattered notes reflecting fear and surveillance, and above all, that watch, which seemed less like a timekeeper and more like a marker of the time of a life fading under the weight of its own shadows. That day I understood I was not facing an ordinary or anonymous death, but a case that challenged the limits between justice and mystery, between science and feeling. It was not just a body to examine or a strange object to analyze. It was a living story, a call from the past demanding to be heard and given voice. And although many questions remain unanswered, that certainty pushed me not to give up, to keep digging without losing calm, with the patience that life and death sometimes demand of me. Sitting in my office, I reviewed every detail over and over, every piece of information, and every clue the corpse and its surroundings had left behind like a whisper. Who were those people on the list? What was the extent of the network of complaints and payments? Why had the gentleman trusted a simple watch to leave that legacy? The true value of that object was not only in the message it contained, but in the silent will of a man who decided his truth would not die with him, who needed it to be discovered, read, and understood. Deep down, I realize that often the dead have more to tell us than the living, because death grants them a kind of freedom to reveal the hidden. All it takes is a willingness to listen to them, to respect the silence their story carries, and let the details, no matter how small, guide us toward the truth. That watch, which at first glance seemed to have only sentimental value, became the key that opened the door to a more complex, unsettling, and human narrative. It was a powerful reminder for me as a forensic expert. What we do is not just science. It is understanding, grasping, accompanying that final moment and everything that came before. It is being detectives of stories time has stubbornly tried to hide. That day, that case, taught me that patience is much more than waiting. It is observing, listening, and respecting. That thoroughness is not a waste of time, but an act of justice. That a life, though silent, always speaks to us if we know how to stop and pay attention. No matter how simple or boring a case may seem, it always holds secrets worthy of being told. The watch spoke to me, taught me that behind every death there is a truth waiting to be uncovered, and that time, ironically, is both our enemy and our ally. And so, with a mixture of respect and humility, I understood that as forensic experts, we not only confront death, but give voice to lives that still, from beyond, want to be heard. The envelope and its contents had opened a door that seemed impossible to close. Every photograph, every coded message, and every detail in that watch began to arrange in my mind a puzzle that, until then, was just a heap of scattered pieces. But the deeper I went, the more I understood the real threat surrounding that man, and the more aware I became of the personal risks I faced by following that lead. It wasn't just the pressure of solving a complicated case, but the increasingly tangible feeling of touching a fabric of hidden power, where the threads could break with irreversible consequences. Nightfall came over me as I reviewed the images and notes in front of me. In one of the photos, a man with a fixed gaze and restrained smile seemed to be the epicenter of many intertwined stories connected to the deceased. I recognized his face from occasional reports I had read. A ruthless businessman, known for amassing fortune through dubious maneuvers, always protected by the looming shadow of impunity. It didn't take long for me to notice that his name appeared on the coded watch display, alongside dates corresponding to key moments of tension and crisis in the old man's life. That pattern began to clarify in my head. It wasn't simply old stories of corruption or clashes among businessmen. There was an underground movement, a silent war to maintain control, where each player chose their moves cautiously, and any mistake could be fatal. As I looked at the photos, a disturbing idea grew stronger. The watch was not just a personal testament, but a veiled denunciation, a sort of last act of rebellion that only someone aware of their enemies would dare to leave behind. I decided I had to scrutinize the list more carefully, looking for patterns in the dates and names. Many coincidences suggested payments, threats, or meetings seemingly aimed at dominating or subjugating that man. The idea of a blackmail network was firm, and every entry indicated that the pressure had not only worn down his health, but had ignited his fear until he became a shadow of himself. I remember the scattered notes I found in his apartment, those fragments of personal diaries where, beneath faded ink, he spoke of surveillance, suspicion, and temporary hideouts. I couldn't help but imagine the scene in the last days of his life. Perhaps he moved with the certainty that the end was near, but also with the determination not to leave his stories lost in silence. The watch, that modest wrist object, had been his chest of secrets, burdened with the responsibility of revealing what his mouth could not say. I then wondered how many times he had looked at that watch, not to know the time, but to remind himself that there are moments so decisive they mark the boundary between truth and oblivion. The next day, at the morgue, the new toxicology results confirmed our suspicions. The substance detected, a rare alkaloid barely documented in forensic literature, reinforced the hypothesis of a slow and calculated poisoning, a method designed to go unnoticed and cause a death that, at first glance, appeared natural. This revealed the level of sophistication and criminal intent behind what had happened. It also explained the old man's discretion, his constant fear, and his willingness to leave a coded message, showing that he was literally challenging beings with dark power, feeling trapped but resolute. My suspicions were confirmed when talking with two toxicology experts who explained to me the rarity of the alkaloid, a substance apparently synthesized by a small group with access to uncommon chemicals historically linked to certain clandestine laboratories. This not only complicated the investigation, but raised the level of danger. We were facing a planned act with knowledge and organization intended to protect high-risk secrets. In this context, I decided it was necessary to safeguard all the evidence and request special protection for the watch and the envelope found. I knew that someone or several people were very interested in preventing that information from seeing the light. I felt it in the careful and evasive glances of some people connected to the case, in their excuses to avoid contact with the investigations, and above all, in the initial lack of institutional support which, I was now convinced, had been a subtle attempt to sabotage the process. On the recommendation of my colleague, who was an expert in codes, I involved a specialized team in network and data analysis, who began working in parallel with the clues I had gathered. Gradually, a complex map of relationships, connections, and tangled motivations over time emerged. A scenario opened up where the victim, with his physical limitations and age, had resisted the pressure of a web of interests spanning from corrupt politicians to unscrupulous businessmen, a whole network seeking to protect impunity and resources at the cost of the life of someone who dared to challenge that structure. At that point, I felt the investigation was beyond me in scale and that it was no longer just a medical forensic case. I was facing a chapter entering the realm of espionage, silent power wars. It was unsettling to realize that the points I connected could lead to a greater rupture in certain establishments, and therefore put at risk not only the investigation, but also my own safety. I remember that while trying to sleep, the image of the watch shone in my mind like a beacon cutting through darkness. It was not only my responsibility to unravel the facts, but also to care for the pieces that slow death had left behind to reveal the truth. There was a moment when uncertainty seemed to paralyze me. What if the message was too dangerous? What if it was a poison for everyone involved, including myself? But I set those thoughts aside and promised myself to keep going with caution, with patience, with the conviction that justice begins when someone has the courage to listen even to the subtlest message. We returned to the apartment for a third inspection, this time accompanied by a small trusted police group and forensic technology specialists. This review was key because new evidence appeared that had gone unnoticed in the confusion of the first scene. For example, we found a small notebook hidden behind a lamp with notes in a coded language. At first glance, they seemed like meaningless scribbles, but applying the knowledge of my code expert colleague, they transformed into veiled statements and signed confessions, names that confirmed the connections discovered on the watch. As a forensic doctor, I was used to details, but I never imagined that a simple object like a watch could be the spearhead of such a dark and well-camouflaged network. However, now I had to dive into that dark world and accept that often the truth is neither comfortable nor safe, but is essential. What I least expected was that very night we would discover something else that deepened the mystery. Recordings on an old cassette someone had left forgotten near the old man's radio. Anxiety paralyzed me for a moment as I turned the device on and listened to fragments of conversations. Distorted voices, whispers, and veiled threats. Voices speaking of surveillance, settling scores, and the importance of maintaining appearances. It was a leap into darkness that openly showed the magnitude of the danger surrounding that man and the entrenchment of interests that went far beyond simple personal or family disputes. The investigation had ceased to be a cold study of causes of death to become a brutal exposure of violence, fear, and manipulation. I realized that the old man who had kept his truth in that watch had been a beacon of resistance, someone who bet that his discretion and cunning would manage to transcend the shadow of fear. That small object now resting on my desk had proven to be much more than a silent witness. It was the last manifestation of a life that resisted disappearing without leaving a mark. When reviewing everything, it becomes clear to anyone interpreting the case that patience is not just passive waiting, but an active search for meaning. Society does not usually value these stories of shadows and sacrifices, where the protagonist silently struggles, but I had learned that every detail, every minute fragment, paves the way for justice to speak, even if only in whispers. I no longer doubted that death had been caused, planned, and executed with precision I underestimated at first. Many lives, many shadows, many lives had intertwined with the old man's story, and only patient and meticulous effort would untangle the skein. I also thought about the impact it would have on those involved if that truth came to light, and how the watch, that small jewel full of invisible ink, would be the most compelling evidence to go beyond imposed silence. As I turned on the morning light in my office, I felt a strange relief and renewed responsibility. I knew there was still a long way to go, that dark interest would have their defenders, but I also knew that the watch had done the most important thing, told a story as fragile as it was powerful, and that it was my duty to listen to it until the end. Because in this work, I have learned that truth is not always clear or kind, but it always deserves to be listened to, respected, and protected. And in that commitment, I found unexpected strength, the conviction that patience, more than a virtue, is the key that opens the doors of silence and fear, so that justice can finally speak. The silence in the room became almost palpable when I turned off the recorder, leaving the distorted voices suspended in my memory like an echo that refused to fade. In that moment, I understood that this was no longer just a simple medical case. I was now in the middle of a game where every move could trigger unpredictable consequences, both for those of us investigating and for those playing from the shadows. The morgue, once a setting where death and silence were usual companions, had transformed into the epicenter of a complex and dangerous truth. What I did was review, over and over again, every fragment of the recordings, trying to decipher patterns, voices, hidden agreements between the lines. Slowly, the figure of a well-organized conspiracy took shape before me, where threats were not just empty words, but forces moving pieces on a board invisible to most. And that old man, despite his frailty, had been the only beacon illuminating that complexity. In his hand was not just a watch or an envelope, but a message that challenged impossibilities, greater powers manipulating destinies without being seen. It was precisely that revelation that pushed me to make decisions that, deep down, I knew could entail risks. I began collaborating more closely with the specialized data analysis team, trying to trace the path and scope of the connections hinted at by the watch in notebooks. Every name appearing related to the old man seemed to emerge from a web of loyalties and betrayals, of broken promises and dark pacts. There were local politicians with histories of forgotten scandals, businessmen who believed themselves untouchable thanks to their financial networks, and even figures whose influence seemed to suffocate any attempt at justice. I remember one day in particular very clearly. I was reviewing maps and timelines on the screen when an anonymous email appeared in my inbox. It had no clear sender, just a short message: trust no one. That warning was not just an alert. It was a tangible reality in an investigation that insisted on showing faces of betrayal and hardship. I knew those words reflected a paranoia more than justified, but also an invitation not to lower my guard for a single second. Days and nights passed like that. Fatigue accumulated, and the pressure grew more intense. It was not only the weight of professional responsibility, but the certainty that every step was being watched, assessed, and probably countered. More than once I noticed small but disturbing details. Suspicious calls to unknown numbers interrupted my routine, casual visits from cold-looking people, and messages disguised as advice on personal social networks. All of that defined a hostile environment where patience mixed with the urgent need to understand and expose. What started as the autopsy of an elderly man who seemed like a routine task ended up being an open window into a world where life and death are contested through secrets, silences, and veiled threats. In that process, I guarded every piece of evidence carefully, but I also understood that it was not enough to just show them as they were. The story had to be told with delicacy, order, and above all, with the conviction that revealing was right but also dangerous. There was a moment when we faced an unexpected turn. A call from one of the experts analyzing the coded notebook alerted us to a new interpretation. What appeared to be a simple list of names and dates concealed a network of messages between the lines, indicating meeting places, dates of million-dollar transfers, and, most disturbingly, references to incidents with fatal consequences. It was a brutal confirmation that this was not just an isolated case, but that the old man had uncovered a plot many times larger than we could imagine. With that new information, I decided it was essential to protect not only the physical evidence, but also the people collaborating, organizing secure meetings, limiting the internal spread of the material, even preserving copies in confidential locations. That internal logistics, which seemed secondary, became vitally important in the face of the certainty that we were in the midst of a risk beyond simple forensic investigation. Taking this new path, I faced an ethical and professional dilemma I had not expected. Sharing information was essential to unravel the truth, but also increase exposure and vulnerability. On the other hand, silence and omission could lead to impunity and the definitive loss of all that bravery the old man showed in his last act. It was then that I understood the true meaning of commitment. Not only to find a cause of death, but to honor the one who gave every detail, so that the hidden machinery could finally wear down. The tension rose when I received an unexpected visit one early morning. A person who did not formally introduce themselves, but whose gaze conveyed the weight of unspoken warnings. They told me my steps were being followed, and that I had to be careful with the information I handled. It was a clear message. The truth I was about to reveal not only annoyed but awakened fears and swift moves among those who wanted to keep it hidden. For a few seconds, I felt a mixture of fear and determination. In that uncomfortable silence, I told myself that I could not let fear be the prison that stopped justice. What came next was a constant effort to balance caution and action. I could not allow the case to become a whispered secret destined for oblivion, nor a bomb that affected those who trusted my investigation. I worked extra hours with the team, organizing each piece of that puzzle with the precision that the situation demanded. It was then that we found fine connections, those invisible ties linking characters and motives, confirming that the old man had been an obstacle to interests that, from their heights, had decided to silence him in life and death. The following days were marked by discreet meetings and careful analyses. We contemplated the possibility of presenting a report that not only detailed the legitimate cause of death, but also left an explicit record of the criminal network uncovered. I knew that step would be the greatest challenge because it meant exposing facts that could have political, economic, and personal repercussions. But I also understood that delaying it was to allow impunity and the continuation of a system that crushed those trying to rise with truth. Amid all this, I reflected on the courage the old man had shown in building that silent legacy. A hidden message in a watch, a coded notebook, saved clippings, and a night of forgotten recordings. The act of patience, resistance to fear, and the shadow of death. Those small details that no one expected but that revealed enormous truths hidden beneath layers of silence and complicity. I then remembered the last hours I spent with his body, that moment when I looked at his face and felt he was speaking to me with his stillness. He was not just a corpse. He was a witness and a martyr. And although justice sometimes seemed slow or impossible, his story was proof that someday, at some moment, shadows could give way to light. That patience had not only been the old man's virtue, but the only weapon capable of challenging lies and power. And though the road was far from over, I understood that brave message had left us a profound lesson. Truth is not imposed hastily, nor with explosions, but with the meticulous care of each step, with attentive listening to every silence, and with the courage to face the hidden even when the risk seemed unbearable. The watch now resting on my desk was a key and constant reminder of that commitment, to unravel the truth not just for the case, but for every life that deserves the respect and dignity only justice can offer. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, I felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. I knew the path would still be long. New shadows would appear, and not everyone would want the light to explore their secrets. But I also felt, with an intimate certainty, that we were on the threshold of a greater revelation, and that small jewel that seemed insignificant was actually the strongest voice against imposed silence. Because in this profession, I learned that there are no coincidences, only messages waiting to be heard with patience, respect, and courage. And so, with that conviction, I continue my path, aware that justice begins when someone decides to look beyond the evident, when they accept that objects can speak, and that every detail has a story that deserves to be told, despite everything, until the end. The following days slipped by amid meetings and vigils, with a growing intensity that seemed to feed off the same shadow haunting the investigation. Every conversation was a taut thread stretched to its limit. Every decision, a leap into the void without a net. I clearly remember one afternoon when, after a prolonged session with the data team, I felt that something in the air was changing. It wasn't just the accumulation of fatigue. It was a feeling that we were no longer chasing the truth, but that it was looking us straight in the eye with a cold and defiant gleam. It was then that we reviewed the coded notebook again and detected a variable that had until then escaped us. Certain marks seemed not just to be records, but calendar of secret meetings that coincided with suspicious financial movements documented in banking records provided by a discreet contact from the Financial Investigation Department. That connection led us to investigate a small office in a residential neighborhood, a place that seemed too mundane to house something so crucial. However, the evidence gathered indicated that their agreements had been signed there involving million-dollar transactions and covert promises to silence critical voices. I decided I had to visit the place, but aware of the risks, I asked one of my colleagues to analyze from a distance while I monitored every movement from a car discreetly parked 2 blocks away. It was a measure taken more by instinct than protocol. I knew that in that scenario, caution was not just a virtue, but a matter of survival. While observing, I noticed a man entering and exiting with unusual speed, always looking over his shoulder. The feeling of danger grew with every step he took. At that point, I realized we were facing something much more delicate than it appeared. We were not just dealing with powerful figures, but with individuals accustomed to using fear to manipulate and dominate at will. Suddenly, an unexpected move. The man pulled out a small package, similar to the watch found with the elderly man, and placed it in an improvised safe before disappearing. That image was enough to confirm I was not mistaken. We were facing something beyond the visible, something coded in symbols and objects like those the old man had left behind. I returned to the morgue burdened by that revelation. I knew progressing meant testing not only the limits of the investigation, but my own capacity to withstand external and internal pressure. I then decided to review the last moments of that patient again, analyzing every element that could be a hidden clue, and it was there that I found something no one had noticed. Beneath the clothes, hidden among the almost invisible folds of the shirt, was a metal card with inscriptions that did not seem random. There was something so delicate and precise about it that, holding it, I felt this piece might be the final key, the one that could unlock the door to the whole truth. It took us days to decipher it, combining graphing analysis techniques with ancient coding systems, until the light began to filter through, and what seemed like a mere inscription revealed itself as a map pointing not to a physical place, but a series of connections between people, financial movements, and dates. An even more complex puzzle. That was when an unexpected incident abruptly altered our course. A call in the middle of the night woke me with an urgent tone. A close collaborator, responsible for IT security, reported an advanced attack against our databases. Someone had tried to erase traces, manipulate records, and sow confusion among our digital evidence. It was clear. We were not only on the brink of a major revelation, we were in the midst of a silent battle where the pieces on the board were our credibility and life itself. The feeling of vulnerability translated into an almost obsessive determination. I knew that truth's labors are alone when corruption decides to break free, but also that giving up was never an option. From that moment on, the work changed. It was no longer just a search for answers or the careful reconstruction of the death of that elderly man, but the fierce defense of everything supporting the truth. We implemented stricter protocols, held meetings in even more secure places, and built a network of trust that slowly strengthened to withstand attacks. It was during one of those sessions that one of the analysts showed me a series of phone records that had been left out of the original map. Among trivial calls, the name of an unknown figure emerged, but one that turned out to be key, a politician with a dark past, access to resources and power, who seemed to be at the center of all the financial movements and silencing. That revelation hit me harder than expected. He was a man many considered a gift to justice, but who was now at the very heart of the scheme. I began gathering all the pieces related to him. Every call, every transfer, every cryptic meeting. The dark web of complicity grew so dense it was impossible to ignore. But the most disturbing thing was finding evidence that this character also had the power to mobilize institutional forces to hinder investigations. It was not open opposition, but sophisticated corruption camouflaged among rules and protocols, using fear and manipulation to maintain the status quo. Meanwhile, we had an unexpected stroke of luck. One of the oldest employees, someone who had worked alongside the old man, stepped forward and decided to trust us. His testimony provided details that no notebook, watch, or recording could. The human story behind a character, his fears, his last attempt to leave evidence, and the true weight of the threats. It was a breath of fresh air in an ocean of shadows. The confirmation that behind every object there was a person with a story of struggle and bravery. And that bravery belonged to us, too, as a legacy we had to defend. The tension, however, did not decrease. The system kept reacting, with moves that tried to destabilize our work. There were moments when I felt we were alone, fighting invisible giants, and doubt crept in unbidden. Would what we were doing be enough? Would the truth find a space to shine, or would it be stifled by the noise of interest that would not let us advance? But every time a shadow fell hard, I remembered the silent face of the old man, his hidden message in that small watch, and the commitment we had taken on. Patience, I thought, was also resistance, and resistance was our deepest act of justice. One dawn, while reviewing documents in an almost deserted cafe, I received a message that still echoes in my memory. They never leave witnesses, but you might be the exception. The phrase, sent from an unknown number and surely a disguised threat, did not paralyze me. On the contrary, it strengthened me. I knew that message contained an uncomfortable truth, that the path was more dangerous than I wanted to admit, but also that cracks still remained where light could seep through. And as a forensic expert, that lesson accompanied me, that every body, every object, every small detail held a story waiting to be heard, that in that apparent silence lay messages that could change everything. In the following days, I redoubled vigilance, but also expanded the network of allies. The investigation was no longer a secret. It was already a faint but constant beacon for those who wanted to see and understand. And although fear persisted, so did the certainty that we were touching something bigger than ourselves, a puzzle whose purpose exceeded personal limits and wove itself into the very fabric of society we sought to defend. Justice was not simply an abstract concept, but a collective act of bravery, beginning with the attentive listening to those silent messages no one wanted to hear, revisiting that morgue, every piece of evidence, every gesture, made me aware that my job was not just to find causes of death, but to give voice to those who had none in life. The watch, the notebook, the clippings forgotten in daily routine. They were, in reality, chapters of an endless narrative that, though fraught with dangers and silences, held the hope of awakened truth. Patience was not only our virtue, but our most powerful weapon, capable of wearing down the coldest steel of conspiracies. Thus, as the city awoke to its relentless rhythm, I felt that we were on the threshold of something great. That moment when silence shatters, when the speaking object gains full voice, and when justice begins to walk again, unhurried but relentless, above every fear and shadow that tried to stop it. I knew the story was far from over, that other chapters would come, perhaps darker, but also clearer than ever. Because in the end, what the old man left was not just a coded message, but a deep and definitive wager. Truth, in any form it appears, always deserves to be revealed, and I was determined to be its guardian until my last breath. What followed was a game of mirrors, where each reflection seemed to try to confuse me, but also left a small crack, a sign that promised to be the key. That metal card, that small watch, the coded notebook, everything fit into a microscopic puzzle that slowly began to reveal a pattern. It was not just a web of corruption and manipulation, but a living network that expanded and contracted, feeding on secrets whispered in dark corridors and agreements sealed with barely visible threats. Amid that tangle, I realized that every person we had investigated, every intercepted call, every figure in a bank catalog was part of a silent choreography of power. And although it seemed absurd, the old man's body had not only been an inert witness, but a hidden messenger. I then began to follow, with almost obsessive meticulousness, the dates that appeared coded. I became a reader of symbols and rituals crossing public life and the private shadows of many. I understood that the little card had inscriptions that, apparently, corresponded to codes activated on specific dates, which led me to review events and economic movements that, at first glance, seemed incidental. These were moments when exhaustion wanted to overcome me, when the city noise seeped into my thoughts and uncertainty threatened to break me. However, the image of the old man, calm, silent, with his watch stopped at an hour that now seemed symbolic, reminded me that patience was a weapon that turned a simple detail into an indestructible truth. I returned to that residential neighborhood that seemed ordinary, insisting that the common facade had a core decisions. It was during a second undercover visit that something unexpected happened. While observing from a distance, I saw a different person arrive, someone who seemed out of place among the familiar faces. He had a nervous bearing, but at the same time a determination that broke the apparent calm. He approached the office and spoke quietly with the man we had seen before, the one leaving the package. That conversation, tiny and brief, seemed to carry more meaning than words could express. Just an exchange of glances, an almost imperceptible gesture, but enough to understand that something was changing, that perhaps the networks were not as airtight as we believed. From that moment on, the investigation took a more explosive turn. New testimonies began to surface. Small pieces of passage of time had left forgotten. The employee who trusted us became an indispensable source, not only for stories but for the courage his testimony entailed. His words spoke of an old man who, despite his weak and routine appearance, had chosen to document and safeguard reckless evidence, defying invisible and powerful enemies. It was a revelation that placed a human weight against numbers, codes, and conspiracies. That elder man's backpack was loaded with fear, yes, but also with a deep conviction. The truth had to be within reach, even if that truth could mean risking all that was known. But this certainty also brought an inevitable increase in pressure. The indirect warning soon arrived, those coded messages that only those of us inside could understand. Altered documents, discreet surveillance, subtle attempts to obstruct every step we took. There were moments when loneliness felt almost tangible, a weight that squeezed not only the body but also the spirit. However, in those moments I remembered a phrase the old man seemed to leave us without speaking. It was not you against them, but you with the truth against a lie. A silent, resilient truth capable of illuminating even in the darkest shadows. The politician with a dark past began to reveal his influence more clearly. He did not only appear in transactions and communications, but his shadow extended over institutions that should have been impartial guardians. He was an enemy disguised as an ally, an actor moving hidden strings behind speeches and laws, using bureaucracy as a shield for his maneuvers. And understanding the depth of that corruption also meant realizing that justice, to advance, needed more than evidence. It required courage, networks of trust, and a firm commitment to not let the shadow win through exhaustion or fear. I felt that invisible battle in my own flesh, the battle fought when power corrupts and seeks to keep its secrets at all costs. Nonetheless, despite obstacles, the web of allies grew little by little, like a gentle stream gaining strength. They were investigators, journalists, activists, different faces but the same determination. The truth, I understood, was a collective good, a commitment that transcended those of us handling the physical evidence. Every secret meeting, every secure call, every reinforced protocol was a step forward in defending that truth the old man had left us without uttering a word. A legacy that demanded not only justice but memory and hope. Because in the fight against corruption and silence, time is always an enemy, but also an ally, giving patience a chance to wear down the hardest walls. The implicit thread in that message I received in the middle of the night was an internal trigger. It not only summoned me to not be defeated, but reminded me that vulnerability and risk were inherent to everything worth protecting. Since then, the guard was never lowered. I moved the investigation to more secure places, involved trusted people, and reinforced encrypted communication channels. As a forensic expert, I know every detail matters. As a human being, I understood that every hidden enemy can also have a weakness visible only to those who know where to look. That metal card, those coded dates, were tangible signs that the truth was within reach, even if behind it lurked shadows much denser than I had ever imagined. Days turned into weeks, and during that long stretch, I learned not to judge slowness as defeat, but as a method. Sometimes, crucial revelations do not arrive with overwhelming force, but in whispers that only a patient ear can catch. The investigation escalated, with spatial discoveries connecting on a human level, economic movements that seem harmless suddenly linked to clandestine meetings, and those very meetings to decisions affecting not just one person, but entire communities. Amid a sea of data, records, and profiles, something that seemed invisible at first began to emerge. Power is an unpredictable beast, but knowledge is its only indestructible chain. That is why that metal card, so small and almost hidden, held a symbolism that grew as we unraveled its secrets. It was not just an object. It was the old man's voice, his final attempt to create a bridge between death and justice. A voice refusing to be silenced by threats or impunity. The map it contained did not point to a fixed location, but to routes and connections, people and dates, pacts and betrayals. A map that turned for us into a manual of resistance and a guide to confront an enemy so sophisticated it did not always reveal itself on the surface. It was the purest expression of what it means to be a forensic expert. Listening to what is not said, finding the evidence, the word that transforms suspicion into certainty. But with every advance, the shadow grew more present. It was a moment of maximum tension when one of our analysts detected repeated attempts to penetrate our information networks. That was no mistake nor accident. It was a direct, silent yet forceful offensive, seeking not only to destroy evidence but to sow confusion and paranoia within the team. We then realized we could not lower our guard for a single moment. It was a hard lesson because we were not only facing criminals with power, but invisible machines and strategies that allowed those actors to move with some impunity. Therefore, patience became a force demanding not only waiting, but anticipating, preventing, staying one step ahead even if invisible to others. In light of all this, the testimony of the employee who worked alongside the old man became invaluable. He confirmed that all that documentation, that set of seemingly insignificant objects, had been prepared with a clear and brave purpose: to leave a legacy exposing corruption, to testify to the human cost of impunity. The truth, I realized, was not just in one piece or one document, but in some of them all, combined with those personal stories of fear and commitment. That contrast between fragile and powerful, between silence and the contained scream in each object, made me understand that our struggle transcended a particular case. It represented the eternal confrontation between justice and cover-up. It was not a path of the weak. There were nights when exhaustion was unbearable, when danger ceased to be an abstract concept to become an almost physical presence. One early morning, after hours reviewing data in an almost empty cafe, the cold air and loneliness seemed to multiply that silent fear. It was then I received that message, an echo of threat that, far from paralyzing me, ignited an inner flame, a reminder that we were on the threshold of a decisive turn. I knew the risk was real and constant, that we were treading on minefield, but also that surrender was not an option, because the cost was too high, not only for the old man, but for all those justice must protect. That night, I remained aware that we were crossing a frontier moment, where patience and resistance were not only necessary, but became massive constructive weapons. The truth began to make its way, not through force, but with the stillness of deep listening and quiet work. With every step, every secret meeting, every discreet watch, I understood that the old man's legacy was not just evidence for one more case, but an urgent call for justice to be a collective action, a resistance born in small gestures and growing until breaking down impenetrable walls. I knew the story was far from over. Dark chapters would come, but also unforgettable moments of brightness. Because deep down, the object that had started this chain, that small stopwatch, that metal card with invisible codes, was much more than a relic. It was a tangible symbol that truth always finds someone who listens, that every body, every object, is a story waiting to be told with patience and respect. And that truth, I thought quietly as the city remained awake far away, is a bridge connecting not only the dead with the living, but all of us who believe that justice, though slow, is unstoppable. Here, at this moment, I knew I would be a guardian of that story, for as long as necessary, until the last breath ceases to be silenced and becomes an eternal call that will never stop being heard as the investigation deepened. The network we had begun to unravel started to reveal increasingly unsettling facets. It was not just a classic political or economic web, but something more complex, almost organic, that breathed and moved with its own intelligence. It was at those moments that I realized every piece of information, every document, every intercepted conversation had layers and more layers that needed to be analyzed from different angles to uncover their true meaning. That clock stopped at a specific time, the metal car with tiny inscriptions, the notebook that seemed like a puzzle. They were all pieces of a coded message, a desperate voice barely managing to pierce the veil of indifference. On one of those days when physical and emotional exhaustion seemed ready to overcome me, I received a new element that changed our perspective. The employee who worked directly with the old man gave us a small, carefully folded envelope containing photographs, notes, and apparently meaningless clippings. However, something in his insistence told me we had to take them seriously. I spent hours reviewing each image, each scrap of paper, trying to find a connection that was not obvious, when finally a pattern emerged strongly. They seemed like miniature maps, routes drawn with a faint but determined pencil, marking scattered locations throughout the city and references to dates that matched the observations on the metal card. It was a key moment because it showed us that the old man had been following, in his own way, a path that led him to where he was found lifeless. This discovery opened the door to an even deeper labyrinth, where every step required double caution. We knew that the cause of his death had not been accidental, but now we understood that the intention had been to leave behind a legacy capable of denouncing from the shadows. Fear and hope coexisted in that dark place where the truth began to take shape. The evidence was not only material but symbolic, a message engraved in small details that only those willing to listen attentively could decipher. And each discovery put us at risk because we were treading turbulent waters where our own reflections could be used against us. During those days darkened by doubt, I was forced to rethink my trust in some close sources. The pressure we received increased. With maneuvers to discredit, internal divisions hinted at through subtle words sown here and there. It seemed that the corruption network we were chasing began to perceive our presence with surgical precision. At a clandestine meeting, while sharing progress with a small group of allies, one of us mentioned a name that until then had remained in the shadows, someone with power and reach beyond the public political sphere, who wove connections between companies, politicians, and security forces. The revelation shook the atmosphere. It was not just a name, but a symbol of the depth to which that corruption had spread, a presence that distorted not only structures, but entire lives. That particular night, after the meeting, I felt loneliness weigh heavier than ever. I walked through streets that seemed strangely quiet for the usual rhythm of the city. The echo of my own steps mixed with murmurs that recalled the urgency of the case. It was then that I understood that patience, that virtue we had talked so much about, did not mean waiting passively, but resisting actively, being willing to keep a steady gaze amidst the silent storm surrounding us. Knowing I was being followed, I settled to work in a public place, protected by the crowd, and reviewed the metal car again under the dim light of a portable lamp. There, in the smallest detail, I detected a mark that had gone unnoticed until then. A tiny number engraved in a corner that corresponded to a bank code, one that led us to discover an account among the most opaque investigated. This was a clue we needed to confirm that corruption did not only move in offices and political hallways, but was embedded in the most discreet finances, in those seemingly insignificant transactions that only trained eyes and infinite patience could catch. And the truth, like a shadow cast over everything, began to touch the surface of the institutions supposed to protect the population. The old man's message, that silent messenger, became a beacon illuminating not only corruption, but the urgency with which we had to act. At those moments I could feel, beyond forensic science, the human essence of justice, not just seeking answers but protecting futures. But the response from those being implicated did not take long. The sabotage attempt grew bolder and more sophisticated. I received calls with silence on the other end, doors that suddenly closed, files that disappeared without explanation. One night, while trying to upload information into a secured system, we detected a cyber intrusion attempt that was able to bypass several security layers. It was a clear warning. We were playing on enemy ground. However, instead of yielding, the team's determination grew stronger. We organized additional protocols, established safe points, and reinforced the internal narrative to remain aligned amidst uncertainty and constant threat. It was a battle not only against those who wanted to hide the truth, but also against the fear they tried to sow within us. Amid this wave of covert attacks, the memory of the old man and his small stop clock became a silent mantra guiding every step. It did not matter how invisible or insignificant the findings seemed, because each one carried immense weight in that struggle that transcended bodies and documents. I began to understand that by exposing justice's vulnerability in the face of corruption, we also found fragile points of our own enemies. The need to keep their secrets, to hide internal conflicts, their fear of the discovery that truth implies. In that sense, we faced a beast whose greatest weakness was precisely patience and perseverance. The human impact also began to weigh more on our conscience. We became aware of the lives touched, families living in silence, employees caught between loyalty and fear, invisible victims who would never make headlines but whose suffering sustained part of the corrupt network. I understood that to do justice, it was not enough to have scientific or economic findings, but that this conflict also demanded empathy, dialogue, and an unwavering personal commitment. At every clandestine meeting, the stories intertwined with the evidence in a narrative reminding us that behind every number there was a face, a story, a hope broken or yet to be built. It was during those days that we managed to contact a journalist whose courage and ethics gave an inevitable echo to the cause. His incisive questions, his critical gaze, multiplied the reach of our work and helped amplify the message the old man had left. He understood, as few did, that little metal car was not just a physical object, but a silent manifesto resonating with every word we decided to share. The collaboration was a fundamental step that reinforced the idea that justice is not an individual act, but a collective movement nourished by transparency, trust, and shared responsibility. But while that light began to carve a path, the shadow moved faster. The pressure led us to hold nightly meetings in changing locations, to use codes not only in evidence but in language, to live on constant alert without losing focus. Fatigue became a companion, and the line between hope and fear was so thin it sometimes seemed about to break. In those dark hours, I had to reaffirm within myself the conviction that the truth, no matter how small or hidden, had an invincible power, that the old man's legacy, embodied in that stop clock, in that mysterious metal card, was both a beacon and an urgent call not to give up. The visible end of that investigation was far away, I knew, but I also understood that we did not need the last piece to realize that the effect of that man and his objects had already begun to transcend beyond the particular case. The most important thing was not just to discover what had happened, who was behind it, or the full reach of corruption, but to activate a change in the way we listen, look, and build justice. That insistence on seeking details, on respecting the stories behind each body, on finding meaning in the small and apparently insignificant, became for me the essence of what it means to be a forensic expert, but also what it means to be human. And although silence threatened to reign at times, every step taken, every word shared, every small act of resistance broke that stillness and drew a path where there had been none before. Truth does not appear as an explosion, nor does it impose itself violently, but comes as a secret revealed only to those who know how to wait, observe, and listen without prejudice or shortcuts. That is why I trust that small object, that card that seemed to speak for itself, will continue telling its story long after we have finished seeking answers, and that there will always be someone willing to listen, turning every detail into a bridge that connects the invisible with the justice we all deserve. However, the peace we imagined never fully arrived. Each discovery opened a new door that quickly slammed shut with an unexpected blow, as if the network we were trying to unravel had eyes and ears watching every move with terrifying precision. One night, while reviewing some documents we had managed to rescue with difficulty, I received an anonymous message. It contained no words, only a blurry, almost ghostly image of that same stop clock we found next to the old man's body. The message was an invisible reminder, a faceless threat that made clear we were very close, but that the consequences could be devastating. I couldn't help but feel a chill spreading slowly, not only because we knew we weren't alone in this quest, but because that small, seemingly innocent clock had become a symbol transcending its physical nature. It was now a reflection of our own mortality in this silent and cruel war. The intensity of the investigation grew as we tried to protect what we found and those who trusted us. New faces joined us, people who lit a dim light in that growing darkness. One of them was an informant from one of the companies linked to the hidden bank account. His arrival was like a breath of fresh air, but also a calculated risk. We couldn't be sure whom to fully trust. His reports provided names, places, dates, and processes that allowed us to assemble a disturbing outline of corruption spreading into the energy sector and contracts with the local government. The implications went far beyond finances. They involved decisions affecting entire communities, on whom we depended to understand the social pulse of the city. The old man, unknowingly, seemed to have become a silent guardian, albeit late, by exposing a network that also threatened lives beyond his own. What followed was a race against time to prevent that data from falling into the wrong hands. One morning, when I arrived at a lab intending to review a series of digital tests, I found the system had been sabotaged. Corrupt files, viruses that protective ports hadn't detected in time, and a deep sense of intrusion. That day, the reality of vulnerability became almost tangible. We were facing not just an external enemy, but an ecosystem trying to dismantle us from within. It was then that we decided to split the evidence among different secure locations, starting to work with a cybersecurity team specialized in targeted attacks. Patience remained our weapon, but now caution was no longer suggestion. It became an unavoidable mandate. Meanwhile, the human connection we wove with the victims and their families grew in importance and pressure. A woman entered the scene, the old man's daughter, with a discreet profile but firm in her will to seek justice. Her arrival brought not only personal documents that complemented prior information, but the story of a man who had seen honesty as a tool to resist, though he never imagined that his effort could cost him his life. I was surprised by her ability to manage profound pain without losing hope, and although uncertainty guided her questions, she also seemed to understand that what we were unraveling was not just a legal truth, but a moral legacy that reached us all. Her voice became a kind of compass in moments when disillusionment wanted to impose itself as the absolute truth. The investigation also had unexpected twists that challenged us to question our own certainties. For example, the appearance of a hidden video in an almost forgotten file, where the old man said, in a voice already tired but resolved, that he had discovered something deeper than the evident corruption, something touching the very roots of structural injustice. In that video, he spoke of names no one dared mention publicly, but which could be key to understanding the entire chain. High-ranking officials, businessmen with transnational influences, and a network of intimidation designed to keep the centers at bay. The quality of the material was poor, but its authenticity was indisputable. It was a powerful reminder that, even in silence and the apparent vulnerability of the body, an intact voice remained resonating to be heard with the attention that history deserves. As I continued analyzing every object, every note, I remembered how that small stop clock represented much more than the final moment. It was a warning, a frozen timestamp so that no one would forget. And in that freezing, in that stop moment, lay the strength that drove us forward. Because deep down we knew that advancing meant not only clarifying crime, but preserving the dignity of thousands who could continue to be victims if the cloak of impunity prevailed. The old man's story, inscribed in minute details, made us aware of the historical responsibility we held. We were not just chasing concrete clues, but a message of resistance he had left for those with the patience and courage to decipher it. It was then that the pressure intensified and the shadow became more real. Veiled threats began to transcend the narrow walls of the laboratory and reach places we hadn't imagined. On one occasion, leaving a key meeting, I noticed a vehicle following us along several streets. My heart raced, but my mind remained calm, analyzing. Every risk was a pulse against the fear that wouldn't let us abandon the work. More direct messages came, media smear attempts aimed at making our investigation appear like a witch hunt. That was a painful phase because Besides the external threat, you bitterly realize that truth is uncomfortable, and those with much to lose do not hesitate to erase anyone who threatens their privileges. But with each attack, our conviction grew stronger because we understood we were facing a crucial moment. Retreating would mean leaving a deadly void. Moving forward was defending justice for the invisible. In the loneliest moments, when the night grew deeper and the city seemed forgotten by those who live its cruelest side, I thought about the legacy a forensic doctor can leave beyond cold analysis. Every body examined is a living story, and that old man, unknowingly, had managed to be an eternal voice through those objects that now weighed more than any testimony. In those hours, I understood that patience does not mean waiting without acting, but persisting with determination, knowing that every detail is a battle won against indifference and oblivion. The collaboration with the journalist deepened, transcending the usual to become a strategic alliance that took the fight to public opinion without risking our sources. Thanks to that alliance, some evidence began to come out of clandestinity, carefully leaked to provoke debate, social pressure, and force official agencies to take action. Although darkness always tried to cover the emerging light, persistence and teamwork became a shield that somehow protected us. In those moments, I understood that justice, more than a concept, is a collective act that needs many hands and voices. During one night shift, reviewing the notes that seemed like simple scribbles, I noticed a detail I had overlooked before, a series of symbols in the notebook corresponding to an ancient cipher system, one used decades ago by a group of activists to communicate in times of censorship. It was a surprising discovery that led me to reconsider the temporal and social scope of the message the old man had tried to send. It was more than a forensic case. It was a testimony connecting generations, an invitation not only to analyze the past, but to build a future with transparency and memory. Days passed amid growing tension and small victories that fueled the team spirit. What seemed like a routine investigation had turned into a crusade for dignity and truth, where every detail carried a measurable weight. Although the moment to have all the pieces was still far, the path was marked, and the old man's story, linked to that stop clock, the metal card, and the enigmatic notebook, continued to resonate with a force that wouldn't allow it to be forgotten. I cannot deny there were moments when despair tried to take hold of me, when it seemed the corrupt machine was too powerful and the personal cost would be too high. But every time I looked up and saw those objects, small, silent, and full of meaning, I remembered that justice is not won by force, but through constancy, careful observation, and deep respect for the small voices that truth sustains. That stop clock not only marked the moment of a death, but the beginning of a struggle inviting us all to listen with patience and courage. And that is how I understood that in forensic work, in the tireless search for answers, the true enemy is not only the imposed silences or constructed lies, but the indifference that makes us pass by without wanting to see what a body, an object, or a story has to say. What I learned from that case transcended science. It became a life lesson I now share with you, because I know that in every detail, no matter how small it seems, there resides a truth that can change everything. The old man's legacy is still there, lying dormant, waiting for someone to take the time to listen without haste, with respect and with the certainty that this truth, though belated, can still open paths that once seemed impossible. Thus, in patience and respect for the invisible, I found the true essence of my work and the hope that refuses to die. What followed was a series of long nights, wrapped in the constant hum of fans and the dull sound of the keys barely breaking the silence. I never imagined that an object as simple as a stop clock could trigger such an unrelenting and complex chain of events. Every piece of information brought us closer and, at the same time, made us feel more vulnerable. The lurking threat was felt in the air, but that very pressure forced us to sharpen our sight, to sharpen our hearing, to leave nothing to chance. I learned that in this field, what seems insignificant can be the tip of an iceberg, and that courage lies in looking where no one else dares. I clearly remember the day I decided to review the notebook once more. There was something in those encrypted symbols that called to me insistently. It was not just an ancient code, but a message veiled in time, a voice in the past that exposed wounds in our society that had been hidden beneath layers of indifference. I began to associate those marks with dates and people who appeared in other fragmented documents. It was a slow, almost meticulous process, as if each page had its own breath, waiting to be understood without haste. That connection to history reminded me that the fight against injustice is not recent, but a thread that runs through generations, and that the old man had taken a brave step to uphold that legacy. The collaboration with the journalist intensified. He had a special ability to translate those dry data into vivid stories, capable of awakening awareness and mobilizing those who, from afar or from comfort, could make an echo. But the danger also grew. Between leaks and counterattacks, each advance cost us tension and emotional wear. Faces that once seemed unknown now became comrades in battle, and the shared confidences formed a human network that supported us in adversity. However, there were nights when solitude enveloped me, and I asked myself if we were prepared for the price this truth demanded. One cold morning, while reviewing some digital evidence in the lab, I found a strange file that was not in the original records. It was a video, hidden and protected, that seemed to have been recorded a few weeks before the old man's death. His face appeared on the screen, tired but serene, with a voice slowly recounting the discovery that had consumed him. He spoke of decisions made in shadowy rooms, officials manipulating contracts to benefit companies that harmed the social fabric, and a network of corruption that not only stole resources, but risked the lives of those who depended on those basic services. The most disturbing part was when he mentioned that corruption was only a superficial layer. Beneath it, a darker system fed on fear and selective disappearance. As I listened to that testimony from the past, I felt his words become a beacon amid a growing storm. The feeling of being watched intensified. Anonymous messages turned into warnings to avoid certain conversations, into casual encounters that never were, into whispers that seemed to bounce off the lab walls. However, every threat sharpened our conviction. It was no longer just about solving a case. It was a battle to prevent the truth from being silenced forever. We then decided to take even greater precautions. We reduced in-person meetings, divided critical information, and strengthened collaboration with external experts. Although fear was a constant companion, we learned to live with it without letting it dictate our steps. The old man's daughter became a fundamental pillar. Her steady presence and sensitive questions reminded us that behind each file there were lives marked by loss and hope. She shared testimonies, personal documents, and even fragments of letters that revealed her father's last days, full of unease and resignation. We found in those pages a humanity that bureaucracy and legalism sometimes render invisible. A man who, despite threats, maintained a firm dignity and a commitment to the truth. In his story, we understood that the true legacy was a courage to resist, even when it seemed the whole world conspired to bury him in oblivion. On one of those endless nights, while reviewing the stop clock again, I noticed a detail that had gone unnoticed until then. The hands were not only frozen at the time of death, but seemed to be strategically positioned, subtly pointing to numbers that matched key dates in the investigation. It was an unexpected twist that forced us to rethink everything. It was not an ordinary clock. It was a kind of code the old man had left as a final warning. That revelation breathed new energy into the team. Every element, no matter how small it seemed, had a hidden purpose, a story to tell. It was as if the old man's life extended beyond his body, speaking through those silent objects. With every new piece of information made public thanks to the alliance with the journalist, the ground grew more unstable. We saw how some official bodies reacted with calculated slowness, while others tried to discredit the information and those who spread it. But brave voices also arose, social groups and ordinary citizens who began to demand clarity and action. It was a subtle change, an invisible wave beginning to erode the wall's silence. In those weeks, I understood that forensic reality is not confined to the morgue or the laboratory. It is an open door to the stories that define a community and its struggles. But not everything was hope. The pressure took its toll. Some team members had to leave the country temporarily for their safety, while others suffered defamation campaigns and more direct threats. We lived through months in which uncertainty was a constant shadow, and yet the commitment to the truth kept the flame alive. In those moments, I understood that patience is not passivity, but active resistance, a constant vigil where every detail counts and every minute can mean the difference. When it seemed that the pieces were finally beginning to fit, the investigation took an even darker turn. We began to receive clues pointing to the possible involvement of new victims, people whose disappearance or accident had been forgotten, but who now showed patterns similar to the case we had opened. This finding forced us to broaden our view, to understand that this was not an isolated case, but a visible tip of a phenomenon that involved much more. The stop clock, which had been the initial spark, now symbolized an urgent call not to let these stories fall into oblivion. In the deepest moment of reflection, when weariness weighed and doubts arose, I remember the phrase the old man left in one of his last notes: "The truth is a flame that can be hidden but never extinguished." It was a powerful reminder that although the path was filled with shadows, the light of justice always had the capacity to break through. I understood that my role as a forensic doctor went far beyond science. I was a guardian of memory and a witness to stories that bodies cannot tell with words. Thus, while the clock kept eternally marking that frozen instant, I understood that that frozen moment was only the starting point of a much greater struggle. A fight where patience, observation, and respect for the past illuminate the path toward a future where injustices cannot hide behind a facade of silence. And although the battle continues and the forces trying to silence the truth are powerful, I learned that in every small act of resistance, in every object, in every story, there lies a transformative power that no one can take away. That is why today I share this memory with you, not only as a forensic account, but as an invitation to listen attentively and respectfully to the voices that seem lost. Because in patience and in the watchful gaze of one who refuses to give up, there is the strength to challenge the darkness and ignite the light. And if that small stop clock could speak, we too can find in the silence a message that changes direction and reminds us that no truth deserves to be forgotten,